This podcast was recorded on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation.
Hello and welcome to The Real Story with Joe Hildebrand. We've got an absolute crackerjack chock-a-block show for you. Woke is dead. It's official. Yes, even Waleed Aly has said so, and we're going to do a deep dive into why that is so and how that is so very shortly. Plus, we're going to speak to a guy who was the biggest anti-COVID lockdown crusader in the country. This guy was at the vanguard. He was pilloried at the time. It turns out he was right. Plus, what is going on with Mark Zuckerberg? Well, you asked, and I'm going to answer. And I have the election date for you. Well, I have an election date for you. A possible election date for you. Could I be right? Remember where you heard it. So I'm excited. When I'm excited, I know you're excited. I'm excited because I've got it all figured out. Everything that is going on in the world, everything that's wrong, everything that's right, all wrapped up in a nice little bow from you. And to start with, we're going to go to what is probably the best news of 2025. And that is that woke is dead. Woke politics, the biggest cancer on society for both the left and the right, because it gives the right plenty of fuel to destroy the left. And right now, that side is winning. The left is destroying itself. Well, woke politics is dead. But don't take my word for it. Waleed Aly, who for many is a leading figure, a leading commentator of the progressive left, he has declared it as well. He wrote a piece for 9 newspapers, and he said this is the midnight hour for woke politics. It is all over. He sort of hedged his bets a bit and sort of talked around it a bit. But anyway, the headline writers knew what they were doing, and they basically said woke is dead. And when Waleed Aly is saying woke is dead, you can bet your ass it's dead. And he's not the first, of course. For plenty of people, for plenty of conservatives, they've been saying it for a fair bit of time, but it wasn't really until Donald Trump's incredibly emphatic victory in the US presidential elections in November that people realised just how much, how powerful, how big, and how seemingly lasting the backlash to identity politics, to the politics of, progressive elites, if you like, what they call in the States, East Coast and West Coast liberals. People are just starting to realise just how deep and how widespread that anger actually is. And again, we saw a record result for Donald Trump, a record result for Republicans in the House of Representatives, a record result for Republicans in the Senate, a record result for Republicans in and Donald Trump in the popular vote, and of course in all the gubernatorial races. I just like saying that word. But he just cleaned up. He won everything. Trump and the Republicans won pretty much everything. There is no way of slicing and dicing this than as an absolute, complete and utter repudiation of the Democrats under Joe Biden and then, of course, Kamala Harris. And since then, the evidence has kept just growing and growing and growing. We've seen with the wildfires in Los Angeles and the surrounds around California, suddenly the West Coast celebrities who are usually all in on liberal politics are turning on the Liberal mayor and the Liberal governor of California, and there's accusations that they were too focused on these sort of bespoke environmental concerns, including trying to save some little fish and giving the fish more water and not having enough water for the actual fire department to fight fires. Now, I don't know how much truth is actually in that, or rather, I don't think there is a huge amount of truth in a direct link between those two things. The point, though, is that suddenly when problems come to people's doorsteps, suddenly the tone of the conversation turns very, very quickly. So suddenly when you don't have the luxury of worrying about things that are sort of abstract, like climate change in the future or integrity in government or saving democracy, suddenly when it's actually a matter of life and death or a matter of, having people on your doorstep or a natural disaster on your doorstep, tends to kind of sharpen the mind. And whoever's in charge Suddenly you don't have as much tolerance for all these high-minded ideals. Suddenly don't care as much about saving the fish if it's a choice between an endangered fish and your endangered mansion in Pacific Palisades. So again, we are seeing this turn, and not just in America, we are seeing in Australia. My beloved Albo is for the fight of his life, it has to be said, at this upcoming election. I'll have a bit more to say about when that might be very shortly. But Peter Dutton, who of course the left in Australia assumed was unelectable. Great, they said when he became leader. No one will vote for that guy. He's just like Donald Trump. Donald Trump just got elected in a landslide. Now, the dynamics in Australia are obviously very different, but it turns out that Peter Dutton is nowhere near as unpopular as everyone on the left assumed he would be. In fact, by most polls, he's about as popular as my beloved Anthony Albanese. And I like Peter Dutton too. He's a nice guy. If any of these people on the left actually met him, they might actually like him. And that is the problem, because they don't actually know these people, and they don't know not Peter Dutton, but people who support him, people who his ideas resonate with, people who think, you know what, we do need better control of our borders. You know, we do need to get tough on crime. People who are the victims of crime, having their houses broken into, or are scared to go to work because street crime is so bad. And that's been reported in the regions, in Queensland and New South Wales. It's been reported in the Melbourne CBD. And again, what has happened here is not that there weren't people who were kind of skeptical about this sort of shutting down of debate, but anyone who spoke up against any of these things, and I did, and I spoke up against, for example, the crazy COVID restrictions that just simply did not make sense. Why were we shutting down schools? You speak up against it. You speak up about Indigenous violence, and you get absolutely killed. You get smashed. You have people accusing you of being a racist, literally a racist, saying, and people doing shout-outs, activist groups saying, hey, that guy who talked about violence in Indigenous communities and we need to do something about it, he's a racist. Hey, everyone. So they're not just telling me I'm a racist, they're telling everybody else that I'm a racist. And you have, of course, during the COVID lockdowns, anyone who questioned any of the restrictions, oh, you weren't just a racist, you're a murderer. You wanted to kill grandma. And this is what's happened across the left. This is what's happened as the left has become more and more dominated by upper middle class, tertiary educated people who often run our governments, our bureaucracies, our cultural institutions, universities. The left kind of becomes the establishment. And suddenly, whatever the latest progressive cause du jour is, becomes not part of the counterculture where people are out, you know, protesting on the streets. Well, there's plenty of ferals doing that too. But it becomes the rule. It becomes what is and isn't allowed. Perfectly literally in the case of the COVID restrictions, which we've seen in the reports released since. There have just been two major inquiries, one commissioned by a bunch of philanthropists when the government refused to do it, and then when the government did do an inquiry, it came back with the same thing. It said that these restrictions were not justified, that they harmed public trust in government, and that people would not do what governments did, told them to in the future. This is a big problem because sometimes there is an actual emergency, but like the boy that cried wolf, because they were excessive, they weren't based on reasonableness or based on evidence, people just won't cop it anymore because they've lost faith in the integrity of those rules. They've lost faith in the integrity of facts. And again, this is why now you see the reaction to something like the government's misinformation bill. So, you know, Albo says, oh, we've got to stop people from spreading dangerous misinformation online. Of course, everyone doesn't want dangerous misinformation going around, but who decides what it is? And again, it goes back to COVID. There's plenty of stuff that would have been considered dangerous misinformation back then that now turns out by the government's own findings of its own independent report, as well as the privately commissioned independent report headed up by the former head of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Turns out all that misinformation was actually true. Turns out it's all correct. Turns out we were on the right side of history. And again, this is a concept that progressives will often roll out. It is rooted in, I don't want to sound like a sort of crazy Sky News After Dark commentator, but I am actually a Sky News After Dark commentator. And they're not crazy. They're wonderful people. But this is actually something that is rooted in Marxism. It is rooted in the idea central to people, especially on the far left, that there is some kind of utopia, there is a perfect world in which everyone is equal, has equal rights and lives together in peace and harmony, and we are on a road to that utopia. That's why they're called progressives, because you are progressive to a foregone conclusion. The utopia is there, the future is there, we just have to get there. And that's what being on the right side of history means. It means when we inevitably get to this place, the people who supported it from the get-go, they will be on the right side of history. Anyone who dared question it will be on, Shokara, the wrong side of history. But again, that only works if everyone agrees that this is inevitable, that everyone agrees that it is an inevitable fact that we will get to that place and that that is a good thing that will work perfectly because we know how it's going to go. Again, this is pretty much standard sort of Marxist orthodoxy that all of history leads to this conclusion. And the problem is that it's not inevitable. It turns out it's wrong. It turns out that groupthink was wrong. And that was what was so dangerous in COVID. It wasn't the people questioning the groupthink. It was the group thinkers who were shutting down any questions, shutting down any serious concerns, any actual valid evidence-based concerns that people raised with this orthodoxy. And it ended up being incredibly damaging. It was damaging to the community. It was damaging to people's lives. It was damaging to the economy. The crisis we're going through is still a result of this. But it was also damaging to themselves. Because Daniel Andrews' legacy is trashed now. He looked so strong at the time and made decisions knowing that he was looking strong. They had the data to show this makes him look like a strong leader. But because it was part of groupthink, because it wasn't actually really stress tested, it's actually torched his legacy. It has posthumously torched his reputation to the point where the guy can't even get restaurant bookings now, apparently, because of what he did to the hospitality industry. And again, you look at Kamala Harris talking about all her crazy little, Kamala Harris is the embodiment of identity politics. She is the Meghan Markle of politics. And she bangs on and on about joy, and she bangs on and on about equality and equity and a little cartoon doing the difference. And she says all this ridiculous stuff. And it is bad, not just for the country. It is bad not just for all the people in America who are, tens of thousands of dollars a year worse off. Who are saying, why aren't you actually just talking about how you're going to make my life better? Find me a job. Get my people off fentanyl. Get, legal immigrants out of the community who are undercutting wage rates or forcing up housing pressures. And instead she's banging on, hanging out with Oprah, all this silly stuff. And again, she is the ultimate DEI pick. Joe Biden said he was going to get a black woman as his vice president. And then he got her. I mean, it sounds insanely racist to me that you would use this criteria, but this is what happened. And it didn't just do appalling things for the country. It didn't just do appalling things for the people who needed a strong president with good qualities. It did appalling things for the Democrats. Kamala Harris, she lost. She got absolutely creamed. People hate this stuff. They absolutely hate it. But they submitted to it for years and years because if they dared step out of line, they would get absolutely smashed. They would be told that they were pariahs or racists or grandma killers. But then something happens. You reach a critical mass and someone like Donald Trump gets elected or someone like Peter Dutton starts to go up in the polls and everyone sort of looks around and says, oh, so I'm not alone. It's not just me. It is okay to question these things or to have some concerns about, whatever it might be, biological men competing in female sports. They seem to love that one. And again, I don't know if I even have a problem with it, but I certainly have a problem with people being told they can't even talk about it without being transphobic. And just the same ways you can't talk about violence in Indigenous communities, if you raise that as an issue, suddenly you're a racist. And again, every time, Moira Deeming, she had to be shut down because she went against the orthodoxy. Turns out it cost not her job, but the Liberal leader's job. And he's no more. Not because he didn't agree with her, but because he didn't allow her to have her own opinion. Again, groupthink kills people. It kills people. But mostly it kills the people who try to impose it. Sooner or later, people say, actually, no. And that's exactly what happened with Donald Trump. It's what happened with The Voice, which went from 60-40 in favour of a voice to Parliament to 60-40 against once people started saying, well, if you don't support it, you're a racist. Again, as soon as you impose this groupthink on people, sooner or later, they will rise up. And hopefully they rise up in a nice, peaceful, democratic way. But either way, as soon as they realise that there are enough other people around them who speak like them, who think like them, then suddenly they'll speak up. They suddenly get that social licence. And I know from talking to people in the New South Wales Labor Party as well, years ago, where it was going in the wrong direction and people were concerned that identity politics was overtaking that. And I'd speak to all these people. They think, oh, God, I was worried about that as well, but I didn't realise, I thought I was the only one. And then suddenly, of course, it turns out that everyone had these concerns. And what did we get? We got the most handsome leader in the world, Premier Chris Minns, a bastion of sensible, centrist politics, but also someone who could be compassionate on all these issues for people who are marginalised because he had that strong sense of the mainstream. And the mainstream is coming back now, and woke is dead. Waleed Ali, he said it himself, and he was right. Woke is dead. So I wanted to start off this year with what I usually do, which is save the entire nation and indeed the world from itself. And I couldn't think of a better guest to have on as our first guest of the year, as someone who has sort of led the way in the fight against the kind of groupthink I've been railing against. He is someone who was at the forefront of questioning some of the more bizarre, anti-economic, illogical and arguably borderline illegal COVID restrictions that have since been found to be exactly that. The two major reviews that looked into the COVID lockdowns, as we have established, found exactly that people like my next guest, and indeed, if I may say so myself, were right all along. None of it made any sense. It was anti-scientific, illogical, and it crushed both the economy and people's lives. And so to set us on the right direction, to set Australia on the right path for 2025, I thought I'd bring in this freedom fighter who was at the vanguard of this battle, Jim Penman, the founder of Jim's Mowing, anti-COVID lockdown crusader. Welcome to The Real Story. It's lovely to have your company.
Yeah, good to be here.
So talk us through, there has been a lot of, I think, armchair quarterbacking about that time. And again, people have had more than enough debate about COVID. It's the C word that's even more offensive than the other C word for most people. But one of the things I have found extremely frustrating is that these two landmark reports came out, one commissioned by a group of philanthropists when it was clear that the government wasn't going to commission its own, and that was headed by former head of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet and now the Vice-Chancellor of Western Sydney University. Then the government commissions its own. It says, look, don't worry about reporting about the lockdowns and the state responses. It goes and does that anyway, and both find the exact same thing, which was that the lockdowns were excessive, that they were not merit-based after the initial phase where we did not know what we were dealing with, that schools should never have been shut down, that it caused all these sort of untold catastrophes. And you see all these people saying, oh, well, yeah, but we didn't know that at the time, did we? Oh, well, this is only now. But you did know it at the time because people like you were saying it at the time. People like me were saying it at the time. And we were pointing to the evidence, pointing to the data, pointing to the illogicality of it all. And we were simply being shut down and shamed by this kind of hive mind of outrage that seemed to emanate, troublingly, I think, from the left. And suddenly, the system was just sort of crushing anyone who voiced any dissent against what was, I think, the ultimate case of groupthink. Just take us back to that time and, in your own words, what made you decide that? I suppose the main thing was you run Jim's Mowing, probably the most iconic and famous handyman, tradesman business in the country. And you were saying, well, look, this is an outdoor activity. We are doing home maintenance that seems to be within the rules. We're going to keep going. And then that sort of just ignited a nuclear war, didn't it? Talk us through it.
Well, It's even more stupid than that. I wouldn't even say group think is it. I think it's cynical political think really was responsible for this. Listen, story is this. In Victoria, which was the worst affected state, we had the Department of Health and Human Services do a detailed report on the way to shut down the economy with the minimum of damage. All right. And this was a carefully considered document. It was about 4 pages long. And one of the things right at the top, it said that individual workers working by themselves, outdoors, no threat to public health clearly. So it went through construction, it went through retail, it went through everything. So it was a really carefully considered document. That came out at the weekend. The Wednesday, Victorian Premier gets up at a press conference and says, okay, you can't have your houses cleaned and your lawns mowed. Now, where did he get that from? As far as I'm concerned, it was simply an off-the-cuff comment, thinking very significantly about his affluent elite inner suburban professional classes who might get someone to do it, not thinking of the 100,000 plus Victorians thrown out of work for no reason. And now once he said that, he thought, politically speaking, it's a lot better for me to bear down and change the law rather than recognise that I made a mistake. That'll look better for me politically. And the damage that he did to so many people and the suffering and the hurt that I saw in my franchisees and other people as a result was just terrific. We went to court later to challenge. There's a law in Victoria that says you cannot remove a person's livelihood without their consent unless for good reason. So we went to court and said, okay, we challenge you on this. What was your reason for doing this? What was your profound medical health advice? And you know what the response was? We don't have to tell you. In fact, we defy you. We will defy you. We will not give you any evidence. Now, why on earth? There's a sound scientific study showing that there was reason for doing this. Why not present it? Of course you present it. Why? He didn't have anything. There was nothing at all. It was simply off-the-cuff comment from a cynical politician who's done terrible damage to the state in every other way too.
And look, I completely agree with you about the Victorian experience, and I know so many people that were broken by that. The strange thing was, though, and again, this is the disturbing thing, is that it became so prevalent and that it spread indeed like the virus itself to the point where not only were governments issuing these edicts without any scientific basis behind them, but people were being shamed. Anyone who questioned this, anyone who said, well, this is not evidence-based, or that this is illogical, or this is inconsistent, or this just makes no sense. How is someone mowing the lawn on their own not probably the most COVID-safe employee on the planet? Yeah. But anyone who actually questioned that, as you did, as I did, got absolutely pilloried especially by the activist left online. And these are the same people who are saying, oh, well, we didn't know at the time. And yet when they were actually being told at the time, they were accusing anyone who raised these concerns as, you know, the usual stuff, wanting to kill grandma, et cetera, et cetera. And this strikes me as exactly the sort of problem that is resulting in the huge backlash against the sort of activist left class, if you like. People I like to call the sort of new upper middle class left. And that is why we're seeing Donald Trump rise again. That is why Peter Dutton is rising in the polls. That's why you're seeing tech giants who used to bang on about providing a safe environment that would protect against misinformation and be supportive and everything. Suddenly they're saying, no, we're all here for the bro culture. We're going to have absolute free speech. And it seems to be a backlash against this culture, this really ugly and nasty culture, but also this really sort of chilling culture that said, no, we are going to decide what the facts are. We are going to decide what is acceptable speech. We are going to decide what you should and shouldn't believe and what you can and can't say. And it just turns out that it's all wrong.
Look at the referendum. That was a great event. You have the government and all the elites, the educated elites and the heads of the big companies all putting massive amount of money to say, hey, you're Australians, you're a whole lot of ignorant racists. We know what's best for you. And 60% of us said, no, you don't. We refuse to treat people on the basis of race and colour. That is against everything we believe in, and we said no to it.
See, this is where I find myself, as usual, in just this really weird, difficult place where I was originally, I was of the left. I supported the Labor Party. I still support the Labor Party, much as I kind of often lament about some of the directions it takes, and especially where people like Daniel Andrews took it during COVID. And so you see this happening. And I was a supporter of The Voice, and had been for years as it was sort of being thrashed out. And then I saw what was happening in the lead up to the campaign, and then I saw these sort of accusations of people being racist if they didn't support it. And it was amazing to just see. It was like one of those dreams where you see something happening and you scream and nothing comes out. And I was talking to people. I was saying, we are absolutely blowing this. We are losing this. This has got completely. And we turned. You talked about that 60-40 result. That result was flipped. That was the other way around at the beginning of the campaign. So when the sort of people who were put in charge of that campaign, and yes, I have to agree, it was the typical sort of, again, left activist, academic elites for whom, anyone who opposed The Voice, they probably thought it was a racist because they'd never met anyone who opposed The Voice or thought it was a bad idea or raised any concerns about it because, of course, they all moved in the same circles and they all agreed with each other. Again, you have this sort of groupthink. And so they go out and they start speaking about it. They start talking about it as though this is something that anyone would naturally just want, and anyone who disagreed with is abhorrent, beyond the pale, is bigoted. And again, you even had groups like activist groups saying the way to win this is to try to push people into a position where if they oppose it, they are considered racist, and that'll get them on board. That was actually one of the tactics. That was one of the strategies. And again, it is just emblematic of the incredible dangers of groupthink, not just to society as a whole, but to the people who try to implement it. So you have these people who blew up their own campaign despite having every advantage in the world and just destroyed it simply because they didn't brook any dissent. They didn't actually acknowledge that people could oppose this and still be nice human beings, have a valid point of view. By engaging in this hive mind mentality, they're not just hurting other people, they're not just hurting society at large, they're actually hurting themselves. It is an act of self-harm as well as everything else. I still see the frustration from someone of the centre. This is the thing I see as someone who sees themselves as being of the sensible centre and having a sense of what is right or wrong and what is a fair go for people and the sort of people who really are vulnerable and struggling and battling that we should be supporting, and then seeing what everyone's getting outraged about. I just think, hang on, sorry, come again? Like we got more than 100,000 homeless people in this country, and people are jumping up and down, screaming about, pronouns or carrying on about, systemic racism in the ABC.
But not only that, the homelessness is largely government policy. The government says we're going to have policies which mean that housing prices are going to go astronomical, rents are going to go astronomical. If you can get, you've got to pay a huge amount of money. You've got to mortgage yourself for years. Why? Because they set zonings in place that makes it impossible to build where people want to live. They say you're in the leafy green suburbs, you've got these big, you can't have terraces, you can't have high rises near railway stations, you cannot build anything, and you force the price of housing up and up and up. Young people can't afford to buy. Many people are in the streets where they can die of exposure and all kinds of assault and all the bad things happen to homeless people. You look at America, people say it's immigration. It's not immigration, it's zoning. Look in America, San Francisco, the most greeny, lefty city in the whole United States, has got the worst homeless problems. The worst problems with drugs, the worst problems with unaffordable housing. Now you go to somewhere like Dallas or Minneapolis, those kind of countries which you've got cities with more sensible policies, you have affordable housing. And people are moving away from these elite bastions of the left. What's stupid? You have a place like San Francisco, you get people who are so evergreenies. Oh, we care about the environment. We're so green. We're so good. If you are a school teacher or a policeman, you have to drive 2 hours to get to work in San Francisco. 2 hours. What do you think you're doing? You're burning carbon fossil fuels the whole way there and back. These greenies are the worst threat to the environment there's ever been.
Well, I think after the fires that just happened in LA, even the Californian elites are starting to turn on the Livers. But you'll be pleased to know that in New South Wales, we have a Labor right government led by Chris Minns that is very, very keen and ripping up all those ridiculous, archaic NIMBY policies to build more housing. So it can be done from the Labor Party, Jim. Have hope. Have hope. Have courage.
There are some wonderful people. I don't reckon Australia ever had a better Prime Minister than Bob Hawke. Love Bob Hawke. Just about his autobiography. He's a
There you go. We just need a new one.
man. But you look Albanese. You look at Albanese. I mean, how can you put them in the same moral universe as someone like Hawke? Hawke was great. He was a great leader.
I've got a soft spot for Albert, obviously. I know him and like him. But what he's doing, the problem is that he has come from the left. He is now trying to occupy the centre, and I think genuinely wants to and genuinely intends to and genuinely is trying to. But because he's got all this baggage and because he's got sort of people around him who are, again, going to these default positions like, of course, Israel's an evil occupying force, or of course the Voice is going to get up and everyone's going to vote for it because everyone I know is going to support it. And so it's a kind of baptism of fire, I think, into where mainstream Australia really is. So hopefully he learns from it and comes out.
I'm not against everything he's done. I think one of the things I approve is that he's setting up the limit for superannuation at $3 million. Now, let's face it, $3 million is what you need for retirement. Anything more than that's a tax dodge. And I'll be quite honest with you, we have a superannuation policy, not because I need it, because I'm obviously pretty well off myself, but because it's a tax deduction, it's a tax dodge. That's how you do it for, and it's legal, and we'll do it. But it's not necessary. I do not need to have massive amount of superannuation to survive my old age.
That's exactly right. There you go. We've found common ground, Jim. I love it. Jim Penman from Jim's Mowing endorses an Albanese Labor government policy. We've got at least one. But yes, no, that's absolutely true. And that is, for the record, of course, the policy that they put in that anything more than $3 million in your super account will not get any tax concessions. It'll just be treated as normal income.
Yeah, I know. The Australian was... I love the Australian. They were gone. I thought, you idiots. I mean, this is just a tax dodge. I don't mind, actually. My daughter says I'm quite lefty in some ways. I think that actually having relatively higher taxes and giving more to people in need is probably a pretty good policy. I just can't stand the green left garbage. I mean, look at Scandinavia. Very well-run country, very well countries. Some of the happiest in the world. They have relatively heavy taxes, and I don't mind. I'm rich enough. I can afford to pay a bit more, but they look after people really, really well. That's a good society. That's a good system. I don't like the level of inequality in this country. The problem is what you've got in this country is a war between two elites. There's the elite of wealth, people who got money, and there's the elite of education. And then there's the majority of people who are not elites, and they are treated like dirt in so many different ways.
I think that is an excellent point and a perfect place on which to end it. Jim Penman, founder of Jim's Mowing and anti-COVID crusader, thank you so much for joining us on The Real Story.
Good to be here, Joey.
And now we're going to kick off 2025 with a little bit of question time. And Ellie has written in with this question. Ellie's a great friend of the show, by the way. Hi, Ellie. And she says, why are we hearing so much from Mark Zuckerberg? He used to be a quiet figure, but now he's doing interviews with Joe Rogan, making some pretty crazy statements. Why is he doing that? And is he good or evil? Well, Ellie, that is a great question. Firstly, to answer the second part first, he's evil. Secondly, to answer the rest, the reason is kind of what I've been talking about, because there has been this sort of orthodoxy of groupthink that sort of said, right, all right, social media companies, there's misinformation everywhere. We've got to, they've got to control this. They've got to have a duty of care. And a lot of this stuff I actually agree with. They've got to have a duty of care to their people. They can't just be spreading all this terrible stuff. And Elon Musk basically just broke ranks and said, screw it. I'm not a Democrat anymore. I'm with Donald Trump. All you, quote unquote liberals are actually just proto-fascists who are trying to censor free speech, and I can't have that because I'm all for freedom and blah, 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 blah. Good on you, Elon. Fantastic, whatever. And suddenly Mark Zuckerberg's seen Elon Musk do that and said, well, if that's the way everyone's going, then I'm with him. I'm going to jump on a ride. And so he is now rolling back Facebook's fact-checking systems, so the fact-checking thing won't be there because, again, it's all well and good, but sometimes we don't know what the actual facts are, and what people say is misinformation at the time turns out to be true. And again, this all harks back to the sort of stuff we were told or not told during COVID. And of course, he just wants to make money as well. So if he thinks this is where most Americans are going, where the values that most people have, what they want to see or read on their social media feeds and how they think that should be curated, well, he's just going to follow the money. And it's the same with, he goes on Joe Rogan and he's getting with the bros and everything. Now, I think a bit of that, like Elon, has to do with the fact that, like me, they were massive nerds when they were young, and now they've grown up and they get to hang out with all these alpha males, and they're like, yeah, I can be cool, finally. But it's also just following the money. Joe Rogan is the zeitgeist. He is where it's at now. Donald Trump, Elon Musk, he is going to go where the action is. And so suddenly all these rules we were told we had to have, all this sort of orthodoxy that, corporations with their triple bottle lines would say we have to adhere to. Someone just suddenly, like the guy in The Life of Brian, says, I'm not. And everyone goes, yeah, actually, I'm not either. Screw that. So that's kind of what's going on with Mark Zuckerberg. He's been freed. And yes, he is, I think, probably evil or just doesn't care. He just doesn't care about anyone but Facebook and his billions of dollars. And just before we go, I promised you I'd give you a little tidbit about when the election might be, and it might be sooner than you think. A little birdie who's worked on many, many campaigns before and has very close ties to the Labor Party and has worked for a few prime ministers, has said that he reckons March 22 could be the day. And the magic of that is that it would be way before May, which is way too late. You avoid all things like school holidays and stuff in April, so you beat all that. And you could call it at the end of this month. You could call it just after Australia Day, which of course the PM wholeheartedly supports, as do the vast majority of Australians. It would mean that you wouldn't have to go back to Parliament. Feb 4 is when Parliament resumes. So if you call it before then, you don't have to go back to Parliament, run the gauntlet, face your questions times. You can spend that time out on the road campaigning instead. It would also get you out of the budget. You could push back the budget, which Jim Chalmers was going to hand down, which we know would have to have a deficit. So that wouldn't be good news. So you flick aside the budget, you flick aside the Parliament, and you stroll up to March 22 election day. And the best thing of all is the RBA is meeting in the second week of Feb, and there is an increased chance that they might actually cut interest rates. So basically a week or two after you call the campaign, the RBA cuts interest rates. That is a pretty good look for an incumbent government, which is arguing that things are going to get better. So that's one little tip that's come to me. If it's true, remember you heard it here first. If it's not, I'm just passing on what I'm told. And that is all we have time for this week. Thanks so much for your company. It is so good to be back. If you've got any questions, if you've got anything you'd like us to dive into, just email us at therealstory@novapodcast.com.au, or you can follow me on Instagram at Joe_Hildebrand and slide into my DMs. You can also, of course, catch my columns every Monday and Saturday in the various News Corp mastheads. And you can also rate this podcast a 5-star rating. You can do it. I know you can. I believe in you. Or you could leave us a little review, say how great we are. Well, I am. It's the royal we. Anyway, it's been an absolute joy. Can't wait to see you next week.